Welcome in, everyone. We're diving into Pema Chödrön today. You guys gave us some really interesting excerpts from her book, The Places That Scare You, A Guide to Fearlessness in Difficult Times.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm really fascinated to dig into her strategies, for like navigating fear and even like turning challenges into opportunities for growth and stuff.
Yeah, it's a great topic,
You think so?
especially right now when it feels like everyone's like dealing with constant uncertainty
Yeah.
and change and, kind of that anxiety that comes with that.
Yeah, for sure. And Chödrön, she starts off by introducing this concept of bodhicitta. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
She describes it as our soft spot,
Yeah.
that like innate capacity we all have for love and compassion.
Hmm.
Those moments when your heart just kind of opens up.
Yeah.
You feel a surge of empathy for someone, even a stranger sometimes.
Right.
That's bodhicitta, like right there in action.
Yeah. What's so cool about that is that she really believes that it exists in everyone, even those people who seem really hardened. Or maybe they don't appear to be caring at all.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. Like,
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
There's that quote she uses, everybody loves something, even if it's only tortillas.
Oh, I love that.
It's such a good reminder that even behind all those tough exteriors,
Yeah. Right.
there's still like that little flicker of love there, that connection to something that brings them joy.
It makes you wonder what makes people like build up those walls in the first place.
Right. She suggests that it's often fear,
Yeah.
that leads us to shut down and create barriers
Yeah.
between ourselves and other people.
Yeah, like
Afraid of getting hurt, right?
Uh-huh.
Afraid of being vulnerable. So we just put up all these defenses. But by doing that, we block that natural flow of love and compassion that could actually help us to heal and grow.
yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think about those times when I've like felt most afraid or insecure.
Yeah.
It is tempting to just like retreat and isolate, but often it just makes things worse.
Yeah. That's a very common pattern. And Chödrön, she actually offers some really insightful metaphors, I think, to kind of help us understand how we get caught up in these cycles of fear and avoidance.
Okay.
She introduces this idea of three lords of materialism.
Oh, wow.
It does sound a little intimidating at first.
Three lords of materialism.
Yeah. But these lords, they represent those very human tendencies that we all have to seek security and comfort,
Okay.
in things that are ultimately fleeting. And this clinging, she argues, is what actually creates more suffering for us.
Interesting. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these lords. Like, who are they? What do they actually represent?
Well, the first one is the Lord of Form.
Hmm.
And he's all about clinging to, like, pleasurable sensations
Okay.
and possessions. Think of that elderly couple Chödrön describes who are living in their gated community in Florida.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
They've surrounded themselves with all this material comfort, but they're also imprisoned by fear
Yeah, it's like,
of the outside world.
yeah. Yeah, it's like they're protecting themselves, but also trapping themselves at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's that clinging that creates a sense of isolation, even though it's coming from this desire for safety and security.
That makes a lot of sense. Have you ever, like, noticed that in your own life? A time when you clung to something external because you were afraid?
I mean, I think we all have at some point. It's a very human tendency to try to, find that stability
Right.
in the external world. But as Chödrön points out, true security, it comes from within.
So how do we move beyond that Lord of Form?
That's a good question.
How do we loosen that grip on material things?
Well, that's where the inner work comes in.
Okay.
And that's where the other two lords kind of come into play. The second one is the Lord of Speech, and he represents our attachment to beliefs and opinions.
Oh, I know this guy.
Yeah,
It's like when someone's so entrenched in their own political views that they can't even like listen to another perspective without getting super defensive.
exactly. And she shares a really powerful anecdote, actually, from Jarvis Masters, who's a Buddhist on death row. And he observed this tendency in both the KKK and in politicians.
Wow.
And they were all so fiercely clinging to their beliefs that they ended up with the same, like, angry, contorted faces.
Wow. That's a striking image.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder what would happen if we could just like loosen our grip on those rigid beliefs just a little.
Right.
What possibilities might open up if we could just approach conversations with a little more curiosity and openness.
That's a great question. And it actually leads us to the third Lord, the Lord of Mind.
Okay.
This one is all about chasing these like extraordinary experiences, always looking for the next high.
Oh, right. Chödrön uses the example of the lawyer who had that really profound experience of oneness with the universe.
Right.
But then it kind of became a problem because she was constantly chasing that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ordinary life just couldn't measure up anymore.
Yeah, it's a great example of how even those positive experiences
Mm-hmm.
can become a source of suffering when we cling to them and when we make them the measure of our happiness.
So we've got these three lords, each representing a different way we try to find security in the external world.
Mm.
But as you said earlier, Chödrön suggests that true security comes from within.
Exactly.
So how do we even begin to access that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can start by exploring these 3 marks of existence. They're really powerful, I think.
The 3 marks of existence.
Yeah, they kind of challenge a lot of our common assumptions about how the world works and offer a good foundation, I think, for cultivating fearlessness.
Interesting. Okay, so what's the first one?
So the first one is impermanence, just recognizing that nothing stays the same. Everything's in constant flux, always changing.
It's easy to see that in nature, I guess, like with the changing seasons or even our own bodies as we get older.
Right.
But sometimes I feel like we resist change so much, like we try to hold on to things as they are, even when it's causing us a lot of suffering.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Chödrön uses this really poignant analogy to kind of illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a man's son goes off to war and is presumed dead.
Oh, God.
The father's consumed by grief, isolates himself from the world, and then the
Ugh.
son returns home, alive and well. The villagers rejoice, but the father refuses to believe it,
Oh, wow.
clinging to his grief and shutting out the reality of the situation.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah,
It's like he's so afraid to let go that he'd rather hold on to the pain than embrace the possibility of something new.
Exactly. And that resistance to change is often really tied to the second mark of existence, egolessness.
Egolessness. Okay, so that means we don't exist.
No, no, no.
Well-
Doesn't mean that we don't exist, but rather that our sense of self isn't this fixed, solid thing.
Okay.
It's constantly changing and evolving. It's influenced by our experiences and interactions with the world.
I remember she shares the Dalai Lama's analogy of the mouse
Yes.
who learns to resist the temptation of cheese.
To avoid the trap.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
to avoid getting trapped.
It's such a good one.
It is. It's brilliant. It's like clinging to this fixed sense of self can really limit our freedom.
Totally.
Yeah.
And when we can let go of that rigid sense of self, when we can recognize that we're not this like solid, unchanging entity, it opens up a whole new way of being in the world.
Yeah, yeah. You become less afraid of change.
Yeah. Less resistant to the flow of life.
Okay, so impermanence reminds us that everything's in flux. Egolessness challenges us to, like, loosen our grip on that fixed sense of self.
Right.
What about the third mark of existence?
So the third one is suffering,
Suffering.
which might sound a little discouraging, but
Yeah.
she's getting at something deeper here.
Okay.
It's not that life is all about suffering, but she really wants us to acknowledge the reality that suffering is a part of the human experience.
Mhm.
It's what connects all of us.
Mhm.
And it's often our resistance to that suffering,
Okay.
our attempts to like avoid it or deny it, that create even more pain.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that in my own life. When I try to just push away uncomfortable feelings or pretend that everything's okay when it's really not,
Yeah.
it just backfires.
It makes things so much worse. It's totally natural reaction,
Right,
but not very helpful in the long run.
right.
Chödrön suggests that by facing our suffering directly, with courage and with compassion, we can actually transform it.
So that's where the warrior's training comes in?
Yes, exactly. She talks about developing these tools of a warrior,
Okay.
not in the sense of like aggression
Mm-hmm.
or violence or anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
but more in terms of cultivating our inner strength and resilience to face our fears and our challenges head on.
So, I mean, this training's not about becoming some superhuman being who never experiences fear or pain, right?
No, not at all.
It's about learning to meet those challenges with more courage and more compassion over and over again.
And one of the most powerful tools in this training is meditation.
Meditation. Now, when most people think of meditation, they imagine like sitting in lotus position trying to empty their mind.
Right.
But she emphasizes that it's not about emptying your mind at all. It's more about becoming aware of our thoughts and emotions without judgment.
Exactly.
She talks a lot about patience, too, or maitri in the meditation process. It's about just showing up consistently, day after day, and just being present with whatever arises.
And it's through that consistency,
Yeah.
that we start to see our patterns more clearly.
Right.
We begin to notice how our thoughts and our emotions kind of hook us in, how they create these stories and these narratives that often lead to more suffering.
So by becoming more aware of those patterns, we can start to loosen their grip,
Exactly.
create more space between ourselves and those like reactive thoughts and emotions.
Meditation helps us to develop that inner observer,
Mm-hmm.
that part of us that can witness our experience without getting, completely swept away by the drama.
Now, Chödrön also mentions another practice called Tonglen, which sounds a little more challenging.
It can be an intense practice,
Yeah.
but also incredibly powerful.
Okay.
Tonglen involves breathing in suffering and breathing out relief,
Interesting.
both for ourselves and for other people. It's a way to cultivate compassion in a very direct way.
Yeah, I remember she shares a story about how Tonglen helped her to deal with a moment of intense rage.
Oh, yeah.
And even though the situation was really challenging, she was able to find some humor in it.
Yeah. Even in the midst of those really difficult emotions,
Right.
there's still space for lightness and joy.
It's amazing how these practices can really help us transform our relationship with suffering. It's not about erasing those difficult emotions, but learning to work with them in a more skillful way.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got meditation, which helps us cultivate awareness and space. And then there's Tonglen, which is this more direct way of cultivating compassion.
Mm.
Chödrön also talks about developing these four qualities that she calls the four limitless qualities. What are those?
These qualities are loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And these provide the necessary warmth for unlimited strength to emerge. They can really help us loosen up those useless habits and melt that ice hardness of our fixations and defenses.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. We've already talked about compassion, but how does she define loving kindness?
Loving kindness, or maitre, is often described as a feeling of warmth and goodwill toward ourselves and toward others. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and seeing past the superficial differences that often divide us.
She quotes Gandhi. He said, "Peace between countries must rest on the solid foundation of love between individuals," which is a great reminder that cultivating love in our own lives is not just a personal thing.
Yeah.
It has ripple effects outward into the world.
And she outlines a 7-stage practice, actually, for cultivating loving kindness. We start with ourselves, wishing ourselves well-being and happiness.
Okay.
And then we kind of move outward to loved ones, friends, neutral people, people who irritate us, all beings as a group, and finally all beings everywhere.
That gradual expansion seems key, especially when you get to those people who challenge us. It's so easy to just shut down or put up walls when we feel triggered.
Oh, it is. It is. But Chödrön reminds us that those difficult relationships are often the most valuable for practice
Mm-hmm.
because they show us where we're holding back, where we need to soften and open up.
And it's not about forcing ourselves to feel something that we don't. It's more about just setting the intention, even if it's just a little flicker at first.
Hmm. She even suggests that we might begin by just pretending to feel these qualities.
Oh, wow.
It might feel kind of counterintuitive, but
Yeah.
it's about creating space for it.
Yeah.
Planting that seed and then nurturing it through practice.
So we start with loving kindness, extending that warmth and that goodwill to ourselves and then to others.
Right.
And then we move into compassion, which we've already touched on. What about joy? It seems like that could be a challenging quality to cultivate,
It can be.
especially when you're going through difficult times.
Yeah. But she reminds us that true joy isn't dependent on those external circumstances.
Okay.
It's not about always seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. It's
Mhm.
more about recognizing that inherent goodness within ourselves
Yeah.
and in other people.
She uses a great example from a cartoon. I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
Where a character is completely bewildered by experiencing a moment of well-being.
Yeah. It's like we're so used to focusing on what's wrong that we miss those little fleeting moments of joy that are always present
Right.
if we can slow down and just pay attention.
So once we can start to recognize those moments of joy in our own life, we can start to extend that feeling outward,
Exactly. She talks about practicing rejoicing in the good fortune of others.
which again can be a challenge when we're dealing with, envy or comparison. It's one thing to celebrate a friend's success, but what about when someone you secretly resent gets that promotion you've been hoping for?
Right. Well, that's where the practice gets really potent.
Yep.
It's about acknowledging those feelings of envy and then choosing to rejoice anyway. It's a way to break free from those self-imposed limitations and expand our capacity for joy.
So we've got loving kindness, compassion, and joy. What about the fourth quality? Equanimity.
So equanimity is about cultivating that sense of balance and stability, an
Yeah.
unshakable peace that's not dependent on external circumstances.
She shares a story about a Zen master who, no matter what was happening, would always say, "I'm okay." It's like he had found this place of inner stillness that couldn't be shaken by anything.
She also uses that really beautiful image of um, a banquet where everyone's invited, even those that we might consider our enemies,
Yeah.
and it's about embracing that wholeness of life without judgment or exclusion.
It's a radical invitation.
It is.
But it feels like that's what she's getting at with all of these teachings. It's about opening our hearts and minds to the fullness of life with all its messiness and contradictions.
Absolutely. And it's not about forcing ourselves to feel a certain way
Right.
or pretending that everything's, always rosy.
Right.
It's about cultivating that inner strength and resilience
Mm.
to meet whatever arises with courage and compassion.
Now, as we're exploring these limitless qualities, I'm also curious about something else she mentions, the importance of having a spiritual friend or a teacher. What role does that relationship play in this journey toward fearlessness?
Yeah, it makes sense that having someone to guide you and support you on this path could be so valuable. But it also feels a little daunting. Like, what if you don't have a spiritual teacher in your life?
Right.
Where do you even begin to look for one?
Well, Chödrön acknowledges that finding a true spiritual friend, it's a pretty rare thing.
Right.
And it's not about, finding someone who's perfect or has all the answers. It's more about finding someone you can trust, someone who will really challenge you to grow, and someone who will be there to support you on your journey.
She quotes Trungpa Rinpoche, who said, "The real function of a spiritual friend is to insult you,"
Oh, yeah.
which sounds a little harsh.
He definitely had a way with words.
But I think what he's pointing to is that a true teacher will help us see our blind spots, those
Yeah.
areas where we're stuck or holding ourselves back. And that kind of honesty can be uncomfortable,
Oh, yeah.
even painful sometimes.
Right. And she also cautions against putting teachers on a pedestal
Oh, yeah,
and expecting them to be perfect.
of course.
She emphasizes that the teacher-student relationship, like any relationship, it's gonna have its ups and downs.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that your teacher is human too,
Right.
on their own journey. And that's okay. It's the imperfections, the challenges that often provide the most fertile ground for growth.
She tells that story about Trungpa Rinpoche and that student who was like causing a lot of trouble.
Oh, right, yeah.
And Rinpoche eventually asked the student to leave. But then when all the other students were expressing their relief, Rinpoche said, "I think you do not understand. Joe and I are the best of friends."
It's a beautiful example of unconditional love and acceptance.
Mm.
Seeing the basic goodness in someone, even when they're behaving in ways that are difficult or challenging.
Yeah. And that kind of love and support just seems essential on this path of the warrior. Because let's be honest, this work is challenging.
It is.
Chödrön talks about this in-between state that we inevitably encounter when we're like trying to dismantle our old patterns and we haven't quite found our footing in a new way of being.
She reassures us that this feeling of groundlessness is totally normal. It's a sign that things are shifting, that we're letting go of those old ways of coping and making space for something new.
But I can imagine it feeling pretty scary.
Oh, it can be, yeah.
Like you're letting go of familiar crutches, but you don't quite know how to walk without them yet.
It's a vulnerable place to be, for sure.
Yeah.
But Chödrön, she encourages us to actually befriend this in-between state,
Okay.
to see it as fertile ground for growth and transformation. It's like we're shedding our old skin, but we haven't quite grown into our new one yet.
Mhm.
So there's this period of awkwardness and uncertainty.
And instead of resisting that discomfort, we can practice, like leaning into it, bringing curiosity and compassion to the experience.
Exactly.
So if we're feeling lost or confused, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might actually be a sign that we're on the right track.
Yeah. And it brings us to a really important point.
Hmm.
This path of the warrior, it's not about achieving some perfect state of fearlessness.
Right.
It's more about learning to meet our fears with courage and compassion over and over again.
And Chödrön offers a lot of practical advice, I think, for how to do this through the practices that we've talked about, but also through these specific slogans or reminders that we can use in our everyday lives.
Right.
What are some of their slogans that really stood out to you?
Well, one that I find particularly helpful is don't be swayed by external circumstances.
Okay.
It's a good reminder that we have a choice in how we respond to things.
Right.
We don't have to be victims of our emotions.
That's powerful because it's so easy to get caught up in the drama of our lives and let our emotions get hijacked by, like, whatever's happening around us.
Yeah, it's a good one for sure. Another one that I think is relevant to what we're talking about here is drive all blames into one. This points to our tendency to blame others for our suffering.
Hmm.
And while it's true that sometimes someone else is responsible for causing us harm, Chödrön encourages us to take responsibility for our own reactions, to really look at how we might be contributing to the drama.
She talks about how even when someone harms us, we can actually have compassion for them, recognizing that they're caught up in their own suffering, just like we are.
And she offers these 4 specific methods for working with anger.
Yeah.
The first one is recognize that you're setting up the target.
It's like we're walking around with this target on our backs,
Right.
and then we get upset when someone aims at it.
It's about recognizing that we're creating our own suffering
Uh-huh.
by holding on to those stories about how we've been wronged. The second method is connect with the heart. This is about remembering that beneath that anger, there's still that basic goodness, that capacity for love and compassion.
She emphasizes that the person who's harming us is actually caught up in their own suffering, which creates more suffering for them and everyone around them.
Exactly. And so instead of adding fuel to the fire, we can try to connect with that place of compassion, both for ourselves and for the other person. The third method is see the person as your teacher, which, again, this might be the most challenging one, but it's about recognizing that even those people who trigger us the most are offering us really valuable lessons.
Right.
They're showing us where we need to do the work, where we need to soften and open up. And the fourth method is practice patience.
Which is a practice in itself.
It is.
It takes courage and commitment.
It does.
But like she says, even a moment of patience can be transformative.
Absolutely. It's about interrupting that, that habitual pattern of reactivity.
Yeah.
And choosing to respond in a more skillful way. And she reminds us that we don't have to wait for like the perfect moment to practice. We can start right now with whatever challenges we're facing.
Right. So as we continue to practice, we start to see those challenges not as obstacles, but as like opportunities for growth, for deepening our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Yeah. And we begin to develop that unshakable fearlessness.
Yeah.
That capacity to meet whatever arises with an open heart and a clear mind.
Well, this deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have like a whole new toolkit for navigating those tough times and for cultivating more fearlessness in my own life.
Yeah, me too.
What about you? What resonated most with you?
Oh, it's hard to choose just one thing. I think her emphasis on the power of practice really speaks to me.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that this is a journey, not a destination. And that even when we stumble, we can always pick ourselves up and begin again.
It's that commitment to showing up every day with courage and compassion that ultimately transforms us. And as we do that work, we start to see that fearlessness isn't about becoming some superhuman being who never experiences fear. It's about learning to meet those fears with an open heart and a clear mind.
And we don't have to do it alone. We can draw strength and support from the teachings, from our spiritual friends and that community of fellow warriors who are walking this path alongside us.
So as you go about your day, dear listener, remember to breathe deeply, connect with your heart, and face whatever arises with courage and compassion. You have the strength and the wisdom within you to navigate any challenge.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.